For 40 years, I poured my love into every brick, every memory of that house. I thought it would be my son's inheritance, a piece of me he'd carry forward. But one night, in a fit of anger, he showed me what he really thought it was worth, and what I was worth. So I made a decision that would shatter his world and finally piece mine back together. I'm Vivian, and if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, you'll want to hear how this 73-year-old woman taught her family that wisdom comes with power they never saw coming. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story will change how you think about family, respect, and never letting anyone diminish your worth. My name is Vivian Montgomery, and for 4 decades, my life was defined by a house. Not just any house, a 1920s Victorian that my husband Edmund and I bought in 1983 for $89,000. It was a fixer-upper in what people generously called a transitioning neighborhood, which meant it was all we could afford on his teacher's salary and my part-time bookkeeping income. But Edmund and I, we saw past the peeling paint and the sagging front porch. We saw Sunday morning coffee in a bright kitchen, Christmas trees in the front parlor, children's laughter echoing through rooms that would know love instead of neglect. We were 28 and 31 respectively, young enough to believe that hard work and devotion could transform anything. And we were right. Every weekend for the first 5 years, we stripped wallpaper, refinished hardwood floors, and painted room by room. Edmund taught himself plumbing by watching library videos. I learned to tile by making mistakes in the guest bathroom that we laughed about for 30 years. The house became more than our home. It became proof of what we could build together. When Nathaniel was born in 1985, we painted his nursery the softest yellow, with hand-stenciled teddy bears along the border. I spent hours in that rocking chair by the window, feeding him while Edmund worked late preparing lesson plans at the kitchen table. That house held our son's first steps across the living room hardwood, his height marks penciled on the doorframe between the kitchen and dining room, the dent in the hallway wall from when he learned to ride his bike indoors during a rainstorm. By the time Nathaniel graduated high school in 2003, that house had become the crown jewel of our neighborhood. The area had gentrified around us, young professionals buying the rundown properties we couldn't afford when we were their age. Property values climbed steadily, but we never thought about selling. This wasn't an investment to us. This was home. This was the legacy we were building for our boy. Edmund passed away 3 years ago, a sudden heart attack at 71 while he was gardening in our backyard. One moment he was planting tulip bulbs for the spring he wouldn't see, and the next moment he was gone. The funeral was held in our living room, just as he would have wanted. Nathaniel stood by the fireplace where his Christmas stockings had hung for 18 years, delivering a eulogy about the father who had taught him that home wasn't a place. It was the people who loved you unconditionally. After Edmund's death, that 4-bedroom house became a monument to everything I'd lost. His coffee cup still sat in the kitchen cabinet, his reading glasses remained on the nightstand, his tools hung in the garage, waiting for projects that would never be completed. But it was still home. It was still the place where our love story had unfolded, where our son had grown into a man, where every room held memories more precious than any treasure. Nathaniel married Bridget in 2019, a sleek, ambitious woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales and had strong opinions about everything from investment portfolios to interior design. I liked her well enough initially. She was smart, successful, and clearly devoted to my son. But I began to notice that her devotion came with conditions, expectations, and a very particular vision of what their future should look like. Their visits to the house, which had once been warm family gatherings, gradually transformed into something that felt more like property inspections. Bridget would run her finger along surfaces, commenting on dust I couldn't see with my aging eyes. She would mention how impractical it was for someone my age to maintain such a large house, how dangerous the front steps were becoming, how inefficient the older heating system was compared to modern alternatives. "You know, Vivian," Bridget would say with that saccharine smile that never reached her eyes, "there are some lovely senior communities opening up nearby. Active adult living, they call it. Swimming pools, organized activities, maintenance-free living. Wouldn't that be nice? No more worrying about broken gutters or snow removal, or whether you can hear someone if something happens in the middle of the night. Nathaniel would nod along with these suggestions, not meeting my eyes, treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person with preferences and feelings. "Mom," he would say, "we just want what's best for you. The house is getting to be too much. You're 73, it's time to think practically." But what they meant by practically became increasingly clear. They weren't concerned about my happiness or my attachment to the place where I'd spent my entire adult life. They were concerned about the burden of responsibility they felt for maintaining something they saw as an albatross around their necks, and by extension, around mine. The subtle comments became less subtle. The gentle suggestions became frustrated demands, and I began to understand that, to them, I wasn't a 73-year-old woman with preferences, memories, and the right to make my own decisions about where and how to live. I was an aging parent whose stubbornness was interfering with their plans for what my life should look like. Christmas 2023. I spent 3 days preparing Edmund's traditional holiday menu. Roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, his mother's recipe for bread stuffing, the cranberry sauce he'd perfected over 20 Christmases. I decorated the house the way we always had. White lights on the tree in the front parlor, garland along the staircase banister, poinsettias on every windowsill. I was excited for Nathaniel and Bridget's arrival. Despite the growing tension, I still believed that Christmas magic could restore some warmth to our relationship. I still hoped that sitting in the dining room where we'd celebrated so many holidays would remind my son of what this house meant to our family. They arrived on Christmas Eve, and Bridget immediately began commenting on how overwhelming all the decorations were, how much work I'd created for myself, how sad it was that I was going to such elaborate lengths just for the 3 of us. Nathaniel carried in a manila folder along with their overnight bags, and something about the way he held it made my stomach tighten with apprehension. During dinner on Christmas Day, as I served the meal I'd labored over with arthritic hands and an aching back, Bridget opened that folder. Inside were glossy brochures for senior living communities, complete with floor plans, amenity lists, and pricing information. She spread them across the table like she was presenting a business proposal, pushing aside the good china and crystal glasses that had belonged to Edmund's grandmother. "We've done the research, Vivian," Bridget announced with the confidence of someone who believed she was solving a problem. "Sunny Meadows has a lovely 1-bedroom unit available immediately. Full kitchen, beautiful common areas, transportation services, and 24-hour emergency response. You could sell this place, use the proceeds to pay for your care, and have enough left over for a nice little nest egg." I set down my fork and looked at these brochures scattered across my dining room table. My table, where I'd served Christmas dinner for 39 years, where Nathaniel had done his homework as a child, where Edmund and I had planned our dreams and shared our worries, and celebrated every milestone of our life together. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "But I'm not ready to leave my home. This house isn't just a building to me, it's where your father and I built our life. It's where you grew up. It's where I feel closest to the memories that sustain me. I'm not ready to give that up." That's when my son, my boy, whom I'd raised to be respectful and kind, slammed his hand down on the table so hard that my grandmother's crystal water glasses jumped. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. "Stop being so damn stubborn," he shouted, his face red with frustration. "This isn't a shrine to Dad. This isn't some sacred monument to your marriage. You're just an old bag rattling around in a house that's falling apart, and we're tired of pretending this is normal. We're tired of worrying about you every day, tired of driving over here to check on you, tired of dealing with your refusal to face reality." The silence that followed was deafening. The word bag, old bag, hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. I looked at my son, this man I'd carried in my body, nursed through childhood illnesses, celebrated through graduations and achievements, and I saw a stranger. someone who could reduce his mother to a burden, an inconvenience, something disposable that needed to be managed rather than loved. I didn't cry. I didn't shout back. I didn't defend myself or plead for his understanding. I simply looked at Nathaniel, really looked at him, and understood that the little boy who used to crawl into my lap for comfort had grown into a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his own convenience. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not my heart, that had been cracking for months. What broke was my willingness to accept being treated as less than I was worth. What broke was my desperate need for their approval, their inclusion, their love on their terms. What grew in that broken place was something much more dangerous to their assumptions about who held the power in this family. What grew was the understanding that respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you command. They left the next morning without saying goodbye. I found their coffee cups abandoned on the kitchen counter. The senior living brochures still scattered across my dining room table like evidence of a crime. I gathered those glossy pamphlets, Sunny Meadows, Golden Years Manor, Peaceful Pines Retirement Community, and threw them in the trash where they belonged. For the next 3 weeks, I moved through that house like a ghost haunting her own life. I would wake up each morning and wander from room to room, seeing everything differently now that I understood how my son viewed it all. The antique armoire in the master bedroom wasn't a beautiful piece Edmund had restored with his own hands. It was outdated furniture taking up space. The built-in bookshelves in the living room weren't showcases for a lifetime of reading. They were dust collectors full of old books nobody wanted. I began to see my home through their eyes, and what I saw was devastating. Every family photo on the mantel was a relic of the past. Every piece of china in the cabinet was impractical for a woman living alone. Every memory embedded in these walls was just sentimental clutter, standing in the way of what they considered progress. But the most crushing revelation wasn't about the house at all. It was about me. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to become exactly what Nathaniel had called me, an old bag. Not because of my age, but because I had been living like someone whose only value was in the past, someone whose only purpose was to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and tolerance her family was willing to provide. I was 73 years old, and I was living like I was already dead. I was tiptoeing through my own house, apologizing for taking up space, grateful when my son deigned to visit, accepting criticism about how I maintained the home I had created with my own hands and my own sweat and my own love. That's when I heard Edmund's voice as clearly as if he were standing in our kitchen. Not literally, I'm not claiming supernatural intervention, but I remembered something he used to say when neighbors would complain about our renovation projects, when coworkers would question our decision to buy in a questionable neighborhood, when anyone suggested we should settle for less than what we dreamed of building together. Vivian, he would say, this house doesn't make us who we are. We make this house what it is, and if someone can't see the value in what we've built, that says something about their vision, not about our creation. I realized that my house wasn't my cage. My need for Nathaniel's approval was my cage. My willingness to accept being diminished was my cage. My belief that being 73 meant I no longer had the right to make my own decisions about my own life, that was the cage I'd been living in. 3 days after that realization, I called Harold Pemberton, Edmund's oldest friend and our family attorney for over 20 years. Harold had handled the legal work when we bought the house, updated our wills after Nathaniel was born, and managed the estate paperwork after Edmund's death. If anyone understood the legal realities of my situation, it would be Harold. Harold, I said, sitting in Edmund's old chair in the study, surrounded by the law books he'd collected over his teaching career. I need to ask you something specific about the house deed. When Edmund died, did ownership transfer to me automatically, or is there some kind of joint arrangement with Nathaniel? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear papers rustling as Harold pulled my file. Vivian, he said with the careful precision of someone who deals in legal facts, Your name is the only name on that deed. It has been since 1987, when you and Edmund refinanced and decided to put the property solely in your name for tax advantages. Edmund insisted on it, actually, said a woman should never be in a position where she couldn't control her own home. I sat there in stunned silence, realizing that for 3 years since Edmund's death, I had been living as if I were a temporary resident in my own home. I had been accepting suggestions and criticism and pressure to sell as if other people had some legal right to determine where and how I lived. But the truth was stark and empowering. This house was mine. Completely, legally, unquestionably mine. In fact, Harold continued, given the appreciation in your neighborhood over the past 40 years, that property is now worth approximately $847,000, according to the most recent tax assessment. You're sitting on what most people would consider a substantial asset, $847,000, for a house we'd bought for $89,000. I had been living like a poor old woman, dependent on her family's goodwill, when in reality, I was the owner of an asset worth nearly $1 million. I had been accepting lectures about being practical and realistic from a son who was apparently completely unaware of my actual financial position. Harold, I said, my voice growing steadier with each word, if I wanted to sell this house, what would that process look like, hypothetically speaking? Well, Harold replied, since you're the sole owner, you have complete discretion. No one else has any legal claim to the property or any right to prevent its sale. You could list it tomorrow if you chose to. The market in your area is quite strong. Properties are selling quickly, often for above asking price. After I hung up the phone, I sat in Edmund's chair for a long time, looking around the study where he used to grade papers and plan lessons, where I used to pay bills and manage our household finances. I realized that while I had been living like someone whose fate was controlled by other people's opinions, I actually held all the power in this situation. Nathaniel and Bridget had been pressuring me to sell the house and move into senior living, treating it as if this decision was somehow theirs to make. They had been calculating how the proceeds from the sale would fit into their financial planning, as if my asset was their inheritance to manage. But the legal reality was that this house was mine to do with as I pleased. That night, I walked through every room of my house with new eyes. Not the eyes of someone who was being pressured to abandon her home, but the eyes of someone who owned a valuable asset and had complete control over what to do with it. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't an old bag cluttering up a house that was falling apart. I was a 73-year-old woman who owned prime real estate in a desirable neighborhood, who had more financial resources than my son apparently realized, who had legal rights that no one could override regardless of their opinions about what was best for me. But more than that, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering how I could make them understand why I wanted to stay, I should have been asking myself whether I actually wanted to stay. Instead of fighting for their approval of my choices, I should have been considering what choices would actually make me happy. The truth was, those rooms had become heavy with memory and loneliness. The house that had once been full of love and laughter now echoed with the absence of everyone I'd shared it with. I had been clinging to it, not because it still felt like home, but because I was afraid that leaving it would mean abandoning the last connection to the life Edmund and I had built together. But Edmund wouldn't have wanted me to live in a museum of our past. He would have wanted me to use the security he'd provided to build whatever came next. He would have been furious to know that his son was treating me like a helpless dependent when Edmund had specifically structured our finances to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone. That's when I understood that selling the house wasn't surrender to their pressure. It was reclaiming my power to make my own choices about my own life with my own resources. It wasn't giving them what they wanted. It was giving myself what I needed. The old bag they thought they were managing was about to teach them that wisdom comes with weapons they never saw coming. The morning after my conversation with Harold, I woke up at 5:30 and made myself coffee in the kitchen where Edmund and I had shared 40 years of morning conversations. But this wasn't a morning for nostalgia or second guessing. This was a morning for decisions that would change everything. I sat at that kitchen table with my coffee and a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down exactly what I wanted my life to look like. Not what Nathaniel and Bridget thought it should look like, not what society expected from a 73-year-old widow, but what I, Vivian Montgomery, actually wanted for whatever years I had left. I wanted to wake up in the morning without the weight of maintaining a house that had become too large for my needs and too full of ghosts. I wanted to look out my window at something that inspired me instead of reminded me of everything I'd lost. I wanted to travel without worrying about empty houses and frozen pipes. I wanted to take art classes, join book clubs, maybe even learn to play bridge, like Edmund had always encouraged me to do. Most importantly, I wanted to stop living my life in reaction to other people's expectations. I wanted to make choices based on what brought me joy instead of what avoided conflict. And I realized that selling the house wasn't capitulation to their demands. It was liberation from a situation that no longer served anyone, least of all me. But here's what Nathaniel and Bridget didn't understand about the woman they'd dismissed as a stubborn old bag. I hadn't survived 73 years, 40 years of marriage, and 3 years of widowhood by making decisions carelessly. If I was going to sell the house, I was going to do it on my terms, in my timing, and in a way that served my interests rather than their assumptions. They thought they were managing a helpless elderly woman who needed their guidance to navigate major life decisions. What they were actually dealing with was someone who had spent decades managing household finances, making investment decisions with Edmund, and handling complex family logistics. I knew exactly how to research options, evaluate choices, and execute plans. I just hadn't been applying those skills to my own life because I'd been too busy trying to keep everyone else happy. Step 1 was research. I spent 3 days online, studying real estate trends in my neighborhood, comparing recent sales, understanding market conditions. I learned that properties like mine, well-maintained Victorian homes with original architectural details, were in high demand among young professionals who wanted character but didn't want to deal with major renovation projects. Step 2 was finding the right realtor. I interviewed 4 agents before settling on Patricia Caldwell, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in historic properties and understood both the market value and the emotional significance of homes like mine. Patricia didn't treat me like a confused elderly woman who needed things explained slowly. She treated me like an intelligent property owner making a business decision. Step 3 was timing and discretion. I scheduled all meetings with Patricia for weekday mornings when Nathaniel and Bridget would be at work. I used my maiden name. When corresponding via email to ensure that no casual acquaintances would mention seeing real estate activity to my son, I was planning the sale of my own house like a covert operation, and there was something deeply satisfying about reclaiming that level of control over my own affairs. Patricia suggested professional staging to maximize the sale price, so I hired a team to rearrange furniture, add strategic lighting, and create the kind of warm, welcoming atmosphere that would help potential buyers envision themselves living in the space. Watching strangers transform rooms I'd lived in for 40 years was surprisingly therapeutic, like seeing my memories reframed as possibilities for other people's futures. But I wasn't just a passive participant in this process. I researched comparable sales, negotiated Patricia's commission, and insisted on specific marketing strategies that would attract serious buyers rather than casual browsers. I wanted multiple offers. I wanted competition. I wanted to sell quickly and for top dollar because this wasn't just about getting out. This was about securing the resources I needed to build whatever came next. The timing was perfect. Interest rates were low, inventory was limited, and my neighborhood had become one of the most desirable areas in the city for young families and professionals. Patricia estimated that we could price the house at $825,000 and expect offers within the first week of listing. For 3 weeks, I maintained my normal routine while orchestrating the sale of my house. I grocery shopped, attended my book club, had coffee with neighbors, all while professional photographers documented every room, while marketing materials were prepared, while showing schedules were coordinated. Nathaniel called twice during this period, both times with the patronizing tone of someone checking on a person they considered incapable of managing her own affairs. "How are you doing, Mom?" he would ask, and I could hear the unspoken subtext. "Have you come to your senses yet about moving to senior living?" "I'm fine, Nathaniel," I would respond, taking things day by day, thinking about the future, which was absolutely true, just not in the way he assumed. Something remarkable happened during those weeks of secret planning. As I took control of my situation, instead of simply reacting to other people's pressure, I began to remember who I had been before I became defined by loss and loneliness. I remembered the woman who had confidently chosen a rundown house in a questionable neighborhood because she could envision what it could become. I remembered the person who had made thousands of decisions, large and small, that had shaped a family and created a life. I started paying attention to my appearance again, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I was beginning to see myself as someone worth impressing. I bought new clothes, not practical elderly woman clothes, but things that made me feel attractive and confident. I got my hair cut in a style that was modern rather than merely manageable. I started wearing lipstick again for the first time since Edmund's funeral. I also started making decisions based purely on my own preferences, rather than what I thought other people expected from me. I bought expensive coffee instead of the store brand I'd been using to save money I didn't actually need to save. I subscribed to magazines that interested me instead of the ones I thought were appropriate for someone my age. I drove to parts of the city I'd never explored just because I was curious about what was there. Each of these small choices reinforced the larger truth I was learning. I had agency. I had resources. I had intelligence and experience and the legal right to make my own decisions about my own life. The woman Nathaniel had called an old bag was actually a property owner with substantial assets, a sharp mind, and 40 years of experience managing complex situations. But the most significant change wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped living in constant fear of disappointing people who had already decided I was disappointing. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I stopped seeking permission for choices that were mine to make. And as my confidence grew, I realized that selling the house was just the beginning. This wasn't about proving something to Nathaniel and Bridget, though I admit there was satisfaction in knowing they had completely misread both my capabilities and my resources. This was about reclaiming my right to build a life that excited me, rather than simply maintaining one that others found convenient. By the time the listing went live, I had already researched waterfront condominiums, planned a trip to Ireland that Edmund and I had always talked about taking, and opened investment accounts that would ensure my financial security regardless of what anyone else thought about my decisions. The house sold in 4 days, multiple offers, exactly as Patricia had predicted. I accepted a cash offer from a young couple named Felix and Ruby Chen for $825,000. No inspections, no contingencies, 30-day closing. While Nathaniel and Bridget were busy feeling superior about their ability to pressure an old bag into senior living, that old bag had just executed a real estate transaction that would give her more freedom and financial security than they apparently had themselves. Now came the part I'd been looking forward to most, telling them what I'd done. The closing was on a Thursday morning. I sat in Harold Pemberton's conference room, signing documents that transferred ownership of my home to Felix and Ruby Chen, a delightful young couple who planned to start a family in the house where I'd raised mine. When the final signature was complete and the check was in my hands, $825,000 after fees and commissions. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the pure exhilaration of controlling my own destiny. But the money wasn't the victory I was anticipating most. That evening, I called Nathaniel and extended what I carefully framed as a peace offering. "Sweetheart," I said, using the tone I'd perfected over decades of motherhood, "I've been thinking about our conversation at Christmas, and I realize I may have been stubborn. Would you and Bridget like to come for dinner Sunday? I'd like to talk about the future." The change in his voice was immediate and obvious. "Really, Mom? You're ready to be reasonable about this?" I could practically hear him smiling through the phone, probably gesturing to Bridget that their pressure campaign had finally worked. "We'll be there Sunday at 5. And Mom, I'm proud of you for making this decision. It's going to be so much better for everyone." I spent Saturday preparing for what I privately thought of as my farewell performance. I cooked Nathaniel's favorite meal, pot roast with Yorkshire pudding, the same menu Edmund's mother had served when Nathaniel brought girls home from high school. I set the dining room table with our wedding china, lit candles, and arranged flowers from the garden Edmund had tended so carefully. But I also spent Saturday packing. Not frantically or obviously, but methodically selecting the items that held genuine sentimental value versus the things I was ready to release. I packed photo albums chronicling 40 years of marriage and 38 years of raising Nathaniel. I packed Edmund's favorite books, my grandmother's jewelry, the Christmas ornaments we'd collected from every vacation we'd ever taken. Most importantly, I packed Nathaniel's baby book, his school awards, the Father's Day cards he'd made for Edmund, the family photos that documented his childhood. These weren't my memories to keep, they were his inheritance. Though not the one he'd been expecting. Sunday afternoon, I arranged these boxes in the living room with the care of someone curating an exhibition. Each box was labeled in my careful handwriting: Nathaniel's childhood memories, photo albums, family vacations, Edmund's books and papers, Christmas decorations. I wanted him to see immediately that this wasn't random packing. This was intentional curation of a life being deliberately dismantled. Nathaniel and Bridget arrived at exactly 5 o'clock, and I could see from their body language that they were prepared for victory. Bridget carried a leather portfolio undoubtedly filled with senior living brochures and financial planning documents. Nathaniel's expression was that mixture of relief and condescension that people wear when they believe they've finally convinced someone to do what they should have done all along. "Mom," Nathaniel said, surveying the labeled boxes in the living room, "what's all this? Are you starting to pack already? We haven't even chosen which facility." He stopped mid-sentence as he really looked at the boxes, as he realized the scope and organization of what I'd apparently already accomplished. "Sit down, both of you," I said, gesturing toward the sofa where Nathaniel had spent countless childhood afternoons doing homework and watching television. "Before we eat, I have something to give you." I handed him the largest box, the one labeled Nathaniel's childhood memories. "These are yours. I've saved every report card, every school photo, every trophy and certificate and project you ever brought home. Your children should have these." Nathaniel opened the box and immediately recognized his third-grade Mother's Day card. A construction paper heart with "I love you, Mommy," written in his careful 8-year-old handwriting. His expression shifted from confusion to something approaching panic as he understood the finality of what I was doing. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with growing concern. Why does this feel like you're giving these away permanently? We talked about you moving to senior living, not completely dismantling your life." "Oh, but that's exactly what I'm doing, dear," I replied, maintaining the same calm, pleasant tone I'd used when serving him countless childhood dinners. "I am completely dismantling this life. In fact, I've already dismantled it. The new owners take possession on Tuesday." For perhaps 10 seconds, neither of them spoke. I could see their minds working, trying to process information that didn't fit any scenario they'd imagined. Bridget was the first to find her voice, though it came out as more of a whisper than her usual confident tone. "New owners?" she said, setting down her portfolio with hands that weren't quite steady. "What new owners? What are you talking about, Vivian?" I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the leather folder I'd placed there that morning. The closing documents from Harold's office, the deed transfer, the cashier's check stub. I held these papers like evidence in a trial where I was both prosecutor and judge. "I sold the house, Nathaniel. Closed on Thursday morning. Cash sale, no contingencies, above asking price. Felix and Ruby Chen are lovely people. They're planning to start a family here, just like your father and I did in 1983. They'll take much better care of it than one old bag rattling around in rooms that are falling apart." Nathaniel shot up from the sofa like he'd been electrified. "You what? You sold my house? How could you possibly? You can't just, without even consulting us, without discussing the financial implications? Mom, this was my inheritance. This was our security. This was my house, Nathaniel," I said, and for the first time since Christmas, I allowed real steel to enter my voice. "Not yours, not your inheritance, not your security, mine. My name on the deed, my decision to make, my life to live as I choose." Bridget was frantically flipping through her portfolio, as if the senior living brochures might somehow contain a solution to this unexpected development. But Vivian, we had plans. We researched facilities, we calculated costs based on the proceeds from the sale. We structured our retirement planning around an asset that was never yours to plan with, I finished for her. You structured your financial future around money that belonged to someone else. Someone you'd decided was too incompetent to manage her own affairs. That seems like remarkably poor financial planning for people who considered themselves qualified to manage my decisions. But let me address your actual concerns, since we're being honest now. Nathaniel, you're not worried about losing your inheritance. You're worried about losing the security of knowing you had a financial safety net you never had to acknowledge or appreciate. Bridget, you're not concerned about my well-being. You're panicking because you realize you made retirement calculations based on assets that were never actually available to you. I sat down in Edmund's chair, the leather recliner where he'd read evening papers for 20 years, and looked at my son and his wife with the calm authority of someone who held all the cards in a game they hadn't realized they were playing. For your information, since you seem to have such strong opinions about my financial management, the sale netted me $825,000. Combined with Edmund's life insurance, his teacher's pension, and our other investments, I am what most people would consider quite financially secure. I don't need senior living paid for with house proceeds. I can afford whatever lifestyle I choose. I watched their faces as they processed this information. That the helpless old woman they'd been trying to manage was actually wealthier than they were. That their assumptions about my dependence had been completely wrong. That their pressure campaign had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about both my capabilities and my resources. "This is insane," Nathaniel said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You can't just make decisions this enormous without family input. What if something goes wrong? What if you get sick? What if you need help? You're 73 years old, Mom. You can't just cut us out of major life decisions." "Cut you out?" I repeated, allowing myself a small smile. "Nathaniel, you cut yourselves out the moment you decided I was a burden instead of a person. You cut yourselves out when you stopped visiting because you enjoyed my company and started visiting to inventory my shortcomings. You cut yourselves out when you called me an old bag and made it clear that my feelings, my preferences, and my attachment to my own home were less important than your convenience. I didn't cut you out of this decision. I simply made it without seeking permission from people who had already made it clear they didn't respect my judgment, my autonomy, or my right to determine how I wanted to live my own life. The difference is, now you understand that the old bag you were trying to manage actually holds the power in this relationship, and she's decided she's tired of being managed." They left that Sunday evening without finishing dinner. The pot roast I'd spent hours preparing sat untouched on the good china, while Nathaniel paced my living room like a caged animal, demanding to know how I could destroy the family with such a selfish decision. Bridget sat on my sofa, frantically making phone calls to their financial advisor, to her sister, to anyone who might validate their outrage or offer solutions to what they saw as a catastrophic development. What struck me most was how quickly their concern for my well-being evaporated once they realized I wasn't going to be dependent on them or provide them with the financial security they'd been counting on. The son who had spent months lecturing me about being realistic, about my limitations, suddenly seemed very concerned about my competence to make my own decisions. but only after those decisions affected his expectations about his future. The phone calls started the next morning and continued for 2 weeks. Not the gentle check-ins of a son worried about his mother's transition, but the angry, demanding calls of someone who felt cheated out of something he'd considered rightfully his. Nathaniel left voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening, sometimes within the same message. "Mom, you can't just disappear with nearly $1 million like some kind of runaway teenager," one message said. "We need to discuss this as a family. We need to make sure you're not being taken advantage of by real estate agents or financial advisors. You're not thinking clearly about the long-term implications of this decision." Bridget tried a different approach, sending text messages that attempted to weaponize guilt and family obligation. "Vivian, I hope you realize how much stress this is causing Nathaniel. His blood pressure is through the roof. We're both losing sleep, wondering what you're going to do next. Is this really how you want to treat the only family you have left?" I didn't respond to any of it. Not the angry voicemails, not the guilt-laden text messages, not the increasingly desperate attempts to make me feel responsible for their emotional and financial distress. For the first time in my adult life, I had no interest in managing other people's feelings or taking responsibility for problems I hadn't created. Their response told me everything I needed to know about how they'd really seen me before my revelation. They weren't upset because they were losing a beloved mother and grandmother from their daily lives. They were upset because they were losing an asset they'd been counting on and a person they'd felt entitled to control. The family meetings they demanded weren't about love or concern. They were about damage control and resource management. But what they interpreted as cruelty was actually the most generous thing I could have done for all of us. I had freed them from the burden of worrying about an old woman who apparently caused them so much stress. I had freed myself from the exhausting work of trying to earn love and respect from people who had decided I didn't deserve either. 3 weeks after the dinner where I revealed the sale, I received something different from Nathaniel. Not a voicemail or a text message, but a handwritten letter delivered to my temporary apartment, a furnished place I'd rented while I decided where to establish my new permanent residence. The envelope was addressed in his careful script, the same handwriting I'd helped him perfect during countless childhood homework sessions. The letter was 4 pages long, written on the legal paper Edmund used for important correspondence. I could tell Nathaniel had drafted and redrafted it multiple times. There were no crossed-out words, no hasty corrections, just careful, deliberate sentences that had been planned and reconsidered. "Mom," it began, "I've spent 3 weeks being angry at you for making a decision that hurt me financially and emotionally. But yesterday I found myself looking through the box of childhood memories you gave me, and I found the Father's Day card I made for Dad when I was 12. I wrote that I wanted to grow up to be the kind of man he was, someone who protected and respected the people he loved. I realized that the man I'd become would be unrecognizable to that 12-year-old boy. I became someone who saw his mother as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. I became someone who pressured and criticized instead of listening and supporting. I became someone who felt entitled to control decisions that were never mine to make. When I called you an old bag at Christmas dinner, I wasn't just being cruel in a moment of frustration. I was revealing who I had actually become, someone who could reduce the woman who raised me, who sacrificed for me, who loved me unconditionally, to nothing more than an inconvenient burden. Dad would be ashamed of the man I've turned into." The letter continued for 3 more pages, detailing not just his recognition of how badly he'd treated me, but his growing understanding of how his assumptions about my capabilities and my resources had been completely wrong. He wrote about researching the real estate market in our neighborhood and realizing that I had executed a sophisticated financial transaction that netted me more money than he and Bridget had in their retirement accounts combined. The letter ended with a request that surprised me, not for money, not for reconciliation on his terms, but for the opportunity to earn back the respect he'd lost. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't expect you to pretend this didn't happen or that we can go back to how things were. but I hope someday I can prove to you that I'm capable of being the son you deserve to have all along." By the time I received Nathaniel's letter, I had already found and purchased my waterfront condominium, a beautiful two-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, modern appliances, and a community that was full of active, intelligent people who had chosen to spend their later years embracing possibilities rather than managing limitations. I joined a pottery class where I discovered I had a talent for creating beautiful, functional pieces with my own hands. I enrolled in a book club that read contemporary fiction instead of the classics I'd felt obligated to appreciate. I started taking day trips to places Edmund and I had always said we'd visit someday: wineries an hour north of the city, art museums in neighboring towns, antique shops in coastal villages. Most importantly, I began making friends based on shared interests rather than family obligation or social expectation. My neighbor Ruth and I discovered we both loved true crime podcasts and started taking evening walks where we'd discuss the latest cases. Margaret from my book club introduced me to her bridge group, and I finally learned the game Edmund had tried unsuccessfully to teach me for 30 years. Each of these new experiences reinforced the same truth. I was not the helpless, dependent old woman Nathaniel and Bridget had decided I was. I was someone with resources, intelligence, social skills, and the capacity to build relationships and pursue interests that had nothing to do with managing other people's expectations or earning other people's approval. 2 weeks after receiving Nathaniel's letter, I called him and suggested we meet for coffee. Not at my new apartment, not at a restaurant with emotional significance, but at a neutral coffee shop where we could have a conversation between two adults, rather than between a mother and son trapped in old patterns of interaction. He arrived looking like he'd aged years in the months since our Christmas confrontation. There were new lines around his eyes, a gravity to his expression that suggested he'd been doing the kind of hard thinking that changes people fundamentally. When he saw me, confident, well-dressed, clearly thriving in my new circumstances, I could see him processing the reality that his mother hadn't just survived his rejection, but had flourished because of it. "Nathaniel," I said after we'd ordered our coffee, "I received your letter and I appreciate your honesty, but I want you to understand something clearly. We are not going back to the relationship we had before. I am not returning to the role of grateful dependent hoping for inclusion in your life. If we rebuild our relationship, it will be between equals who respect each other's autonomy. I don't need your financial support, your housing recommendations, or your permission to make decisions about my own life. What I might consider eventually is a relationship with a son who values my company because he enjoys it, not because he feels obligated to manage me." To his credit, Nathaniel didn't argue, didn't try to negotiate or minimize what had happened between us. He simply nodded and said, "I understand, and I want to earn that relationship, even if it takes years. You were right about everything, Mom. I became someone I don't respect, and I hurt someone I should have protected." 6 months later, as I sit in my waterfront condo watching sailboats navigate the harbor outside my window, I can honestly say that being called an old bag was one of the most liberating experiences of my life. Not because the insult itself was freeing, but because it forced me to examine whether I had indeed become someone whose only value was in the past, someone who existed at the mercy of other people's tolerance. The answer was that I had allowed myself to become that person, but I didn't have to remain that person. At 73, I discovered that I still had the power to reinvent my circumstances, to demand respect rather than beg for it, to build a life based on my own choices rather than other people's convenience. Nathaniel visits occasionally now, not because he feels obligated to check on his helpless mother, but because he genuinely seems to enjoy my company and wants to share what's happening in his life. These visits happen on my terms, when I'm prepared for company, when I choose to open my door, rather than when family duty demands it. We're slowly rebuilding something that might eventually resemble the relationship we should have had all along, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation and assumed dependence. It may take years, it may never fully heal, but it will be honest in a way our previous relationship never was. Bridget has not been invited to participate in this reconciliation, and I've made it clear that any future relationship with her would require acknowledgement of how badly she misjudged both my character and my capabilities. Some people prove themselves capable of growth and change. Others simply reveal who they've always been. If you're someone who has been made to feel like your best years are behind you, someone whose opinions have been dismissed because of your age, someone whose family treats your preferences as obstacles rather than valid choices, I want you to understand something. You have more power than they realize. You have more resources than they've acknowledged. You have more options than they've allowed you to consider. The house sale wasn't revenge against my son, though I admit there was satisfaction in surprising him with the scope of my independence. The real victory was discovering that I didn't need his permission to live my life fully, his approval to make my own decisions, or his understanding to pursue my own happiness. Sometimes the people who try to diminish you are actually offering you the greatest gift possible. They're forcing you to discover just how strong you actually are. Thank you for listening to my story of how one insult became the catalyst for the most empowering period of my life. If you enjoyed hearing about how this old bag taught her family the true value of respect and independence, please subscribe to this channel for more stories of people who refuse to accept other people's limitations on their possibilities. Share your own stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear about times when someone's low expectations of you became the motivation for you to exceed even your own expectations of yourself. And remember, it's never too late to surprise people with who you really are underneath who they decided you were. Age is not surrender, experience is power, and sometimes the best inheritance you can give your family is the lesson that underestimating people has consequences they never saw coming.